Now that we have the science of fermentation down, it's finally time to make your own starter. The entire process of creating a sourdough starter takes about 2 weeks. And at this point, you really need to devote some time every day to care for your starter. But if done right, you'll only need to do this process once, and your starter will last a lifetime and even has the potential to outlive you. In this video, we'll discuss how to make a starter from scratch and exactly what you should expect during this time period. Our goal in the starter creation process is to transform a microbial mixture into a tightly controlled ecosystem, which we can use as a tool for bread making. So now let's get started. This process couldn't be more simple. All you're really doing is combining a little bit of flour with a little bit of water. And as you can see, this is like a really small amount of flour and water, and this is enough to kickstart your starter. So you want to mix it all together. And the yeast and the bacteria in your flour will get immediately activated when you combine it with water. And they're pretty voracious eaters, so they will metabolize the flour, but you just have to make sure that everything is hydrated because they can't metabolize or process or eat, whatever you want to say, dry flour. So what we're making here is 100% hydration starter, and what that means is that there's an equal ratio of water and flour by weight. So we started here with 15 grams of water and 15 grams of flour. And I like to do 100% hydration starter because most recipes you will see published online do use 100% hydration starter. So I think it's the most versatile. So here's a couple important things to remember. You want to make sure that you use filtered water because a lot of tap water in our cities have a lot of chlorine and other chemicals that could affect the microorganisms in your starter. Remember that temperature is really, really important for fermentation. So you want to make sure that this starter is in a nice warm place, preferably around 75 to 80 degrees. A good place to keep it is in the oven with your light on because that'll really warm things up. Just make sure to put a note on your oven letting your family or whoever lives with you know that there is a starter in there. So now we'll cover your container just so we make sure that there's nothing that can get in there. Like a lot of us have fruit flies in our house, it's just a fact of life. And you want to make sure that they can't get in here, and just make sure that don't seal it too tightly. A lot of you will probably use mason jars. Don't seal your jar too tightly because you want to make sure that the carbon dioxide that's being produced right now can still kind of seep out. Otherwise, this happened to me when I first made my starter. My jar actually exploded because of all the CO2 buildup in there. So another thing that you can remember is that starters are extremely resilient. You could forget to feed it at the exact same time, or you could forget to feed it for one day, but it'll be okay. As long as you continue feeding it and keep it in a nice warm place, it will bounce back and you will get a nice healthy starter at the end of it. Think of your starter as its own little universe. The microorganisms within are living their entire life cycles in your container. Just like any other living thing, part of that cycle is eating. So that's why we feed or refresh our starter with new sources of nutrition, which in this case is flour and water. We'll give you the exact instructions for when and how much to feed your starter throughout this process in the download section. So make sure you print that out or download it to your device. On day 2, you will notice that all you have to do is stir your starter, because at that point your starter is just building up its microbial community and it doesn't really need to be refreshed just yet. So here we have the starter that we just mixed. As you can see, there's really nothing going on with it. It just looks like a paste of flour and water. And this one is our starter from day 3. As you can see, there's a lot of little bubbles in there, and there's even a little bit of liquid, that liquid is called hooch. It's an alcoholic byproduct of fermentation. It's totally normal. And yeah, it's a little bit more gray, a little bit, if you look at the texture, a little bit more liquidy than when we first started. It also has a lot of the extensibility that will happen when gluten develops. And now we're ready to feed. And hooch is actually a good indication that your starter is hungry because it's exhausted its food sources. So now we're gonna do our first feeding. And to do that, you just measure out 15 grams of your starter that you made. So we measured out 15 grams of starter, and all of your other starter that's left over, we just discard it or throw it away. And that's a really important part of the feeding process. You do need to get rid of a fair bit of your starter in the beginning, and that's really confusing for people at first, but remember, your starter is a living community of yeast and bacteria. So all of these things need to eat, and if you have way too much in there, there's not gonna be enough food and you won't be able to keep it up or maintain it. So now we measure out 30 grams of all-purpose flour. Okay. And 30 grams of water. And remember, mix it all together to make sure that your flour is all hydrated. Otherwise, your starter can't metabolize it. And there you go. You've completed your first ever starter feeding. Super easy. That's all there is to it. Now all you have to do is return this to your container, preferably one that doesn't have your old starter in it, and put it in a warm place and lightly seal it. So now that you've done your first feeding, just remember that you'll have to do this every day, at least once a day, until your starter is fully mature and ready. So during this process, you'll notice that your starter will go through a lot of changes. It'll have changes in the way that your starter smells, the way that the consistency of your starter, and the way it looks. So there's usually between the third and the fifth day when your starter loses a lot of activity. It's just completely flat. And I like to call that the starter slump, and that's usually when people get a little bit scared because they think they've killed their starter. But all it is that your starter is trying to gain strength, trying to create a harmonious balance of yeast and good bacteria that you can use to make bread. So don't let that scare you. If you continue feeding your starter, it'll just bounce right back up and become really strong and healthy, and you can finally use it to make bread. Remember that the process of creating a starter takes between 7 to 14 days. So it really depends on your own personal environment and the strength of the microorganisms in your starter. Everybody's different. Each starter culture is unique. So you'll notice a lot of changes in aroma. Your starter could smell really sweet or cheesy or smell a little bit like nail polish or alcohol, and that's completely normal. Those are parts of the process of fermentation. After feeding your starter for the first time, you might notice a huge jump in activity. Your starter could start looking really bubbly. You could see signs of a rise in it, but don't let that fool you. Your starter is not yet mature, ready, or dependable. So at the end of this 7 to 14 day process, remember you started with something that looks like this, just kind of pasty, no activity at all, and you're gonna end up with something like this. Something super bubbly, very thick and viscous, and probably smells really yeasty and really good. So this is our mature starter that's ready to make bread. And this is a starter that's also matured, but we've built it up with more flour and water so that when you go to use it, you have some left over to keep and store for your next loaves of bread. Now our starter is ready, and when I was first new at making starters, I used to always mark mine with tape just to make sure that I knew how much it rose. So now, as you can see, this one has doubled or tripled. And it's really nice and bubbly, and you can see bubbles all throughout. And that's a really good indication for knowing that your starter is ready, just that increase in volume and the bubbliness of it, because now you know that the CO2 has built up. Another way that beginners will tell you to test your starter is by doing a flow test. And all that is grabbing a tall cup of water like this one and dropping just a tiny bit of starter in there to see if it floats. Let's see. Ta-da! There you go. And that means that your starter has built enough CO2 to make bread rise. But the flow test is great, but it's a little bit unreliable because if you scoop your starter out a little bit too aggressively and pop those bubbles, your starter might not float, but it could like show all the indications that it's ready, which is that it's increased in volume. You can obviously see all the bubbles in there, but if you pop those when you drop your little bit of starter in the water, it could not float. So just always watch out for the indicators of fermentation instead. So our goal with the entire process of making our starter is to build one that's vigorous, healthy, and dependable. So vigorous means that it rises, triples or doubles in volume every time you feed it. And healthy means that you've built a really good mix of bacteria and yeast in your starter, and you're nurturing that with consistent feeding, making sure that you're using filtered water, making sure that you're using good quality organic flour, and dependable, which is the most important part that I think a lot of people miss, is that every time you feed your starter, it should rise dependably, which means if your starter is rising in a matter of 4 hours, it should always rise in a matter of 4 hours, just so you can kind of time that variable in your bake.